you so much. Mariah, this lady here.
Thank you very much indeed. It's the second time I've had the privilege of talking about my mother's life. She was going to do a talk and then didn't feel up to it, so I was roped in. So you must understand that when you talk about your mother while she's there, you make mistakes. So you'll have to forgive me if I make mistakes about some facts about her life. But I have spoken to her quite a lot, so I hope I've got most of the facts right. There's been quite a lot in the last few weeks about the First World War. And in fact, Mariah was born on the 4th month of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. So one of those very rare people I know who was born in the middle of the First World War. You do wonder why people decided to have children in the First World War, but I think by 1916, so many of them had decided that the parents weren't going to survive the war, that they thought, well, we'll have children anyway, because at least if we die, then our children will live on. And that's what happened with, I'm sure, with Mariah's parents, and also her husband, who also was born in 1916. So that's where she started. She was born, her name was Rhoda Mary Hart, so sometimes we get letters addressed to Rhoda, and I'll explain why later, although she called herself Mariah here. Her family come from Berkshire, so we go back to about, I don't know how many generations, back way beyond, about the 1600s, and her family lived in Berkshire for something like 15 generations. Wow. And a long time, all around near Reading, if you know where Reading is, a place called Wokingham, Barkham, Arborfield, places like that, where the family lived for a very long time. From our perspective, life starts to get a bit interesting around 1700, where one of the persons was called Thomas Simonds. He was born. He had two sons. One was Thomas and one was William. William took an interest in brewing, beer this was, and he started a brewery, and he started doing very well. So aged about 23, he made a huge brewery in Reading, which carried on for nearly 100 years. And not long after that, he asked for his cousins to help him. And it's quite interesting, his two cousins helped him, but just by coincidence, when I used to go and see my granny, she didn't often give me a birthday present, but if I visited her, as I left, there would be a brown paper bag with something in it, and the something in it was usually one of the old heirlooms and so on from the house, and sometimes there were bits of silver and bits of this. But one day she gave me one of these, and it's a book of Robinson Crusoe from 1777. Now you can go into lots of old antique bookshops and get one of these books. But the thing about this one was, which is interesting, is that they obviously decided to write in the flyleaf. So obviously somebody's decided to write in it, and in the middle of the book it says, in fact I can show you that bit, I think. That's it. It says Thomas Simonds, his book, May the 4th, 1784. So in a way that's almost more interesting than the book. And then you work out and say, well, who wrote in the flyleaf? And you work out that if it was Thomas Simonds, he must have been 53 when he did it. And you thought, well, what's a 53-year-old doing writing in a book? And of course, then you work out it wasn't him, it was his children who wrote in the book. So one of these young men wrote in the book, just practicing their sort of Gothic script. So anyway, when these chaps grew up, they were asked, these two young men were asked by their cousin if they'd start a bank. Now, the chap in the brewery was having difficulty with his bankers, so he asked his cousins, would you please work a bank for me? So they started a bank in Reading, and they were bankers then for about 100 years. Now, it sounds very grand, owning a bank, but actually, if I tell you that when it was finally bought by Barclays 100 years later, it still only had 12 branches, so it was sort of a bit like a sort of bank for Derby or something like that. So it only had 12 branches, but the bank kept the family going for quite a long time and looked after the interests of the other brother, the cousin who ran the brewery. And if you go to Reading today on King Street, there's this building on King Street, and it says the doorway of J&C Simonds. These are the two brothers, and so they set up the bank, and in fact, for generations of Simonds worked in the bank, including Mariah's father. He was the last one to work in the bank there. So that's a bit of their history. Mariah's father, Mariah's grandfather had 7 children. He had 5 daughters first, and you know they were desperate to have sons in those days, so they kept going. And so fortunately, number 6 and number 7 were sons. Number 6 was Mariah's father, but there were 5 maiden aunts, and they had these funny rules in those days where you had to sort of get married in order, and so most of these, because the eldest didn't get married, I think they ended up as maiden aunts. So they all lived with father in this rather large house, and I think eventually only one of them got married. The rest weren't able to get married because there's rather strange rules at the time. That picture was taken in 1895, and they were all of Mariah's aunts. And this is another picture taken near the time of, this is her father and her uncle. They're rather posing. I don't know quite what this pose means, but I think they were probably sitting in the garden, and it's all very fancy dress for the ladies. And uncle went off to the Indian Army, and this one here, this man went to the bank in Reading. So that's a bit of their history. Now her mother, Betty Simonds, and we do have a word, sometimes we call it cradle snatching, when you marry someone much younger than yourself. And so Mariah's father, John, was 32 when he married Aline, who was only 19. Rumour has it that Aline only wanted to marry John Simonds because he would allow her to go hunting 3 days a week. So, but anyway, they were married in 1911, I think, just before the outbreak of the First World War. Aline was actually partly an Australian, and that little lady there is Mariah's granny, and she's an Aussie. She's the youngest of 11 children born to somebody in Melbourne, Australia. And this chap, our grandfather, went out to the ADC, someone to help the governor of Victoria, which is a state in Australia. And not only did he go and help the governor do his job, but he came back with one of the daughters. And so she came back, and her name was Rhoda. So which is why Mariah's first name is Rhoda, because of her granny, who's an Australian. She's a very tough lady, this Australian. She used to ride side saddle out hunting and play furious games of tennis, and so she was quite a character, really. In fact, when Mariah was very young, this lady used to organise tennis tournaments in the village for all the young people, and they used to turn up, and the young men were not allowed to hog the prettiest girls. Everybody had to play with everybody else in these tournaments. But actually, one of the tournaments that Mariah played in was against the son of an army captain in the village. There was a chap called John Hart, and so they met. They didn't realise they were going to meet some time later, but in the village they had these tennis games, and there was Mariah. She didn't realise she was playing tennis with her future husband. But so that's around Barkham. So the family home was this rather large pad in Arborfield. I can't tell you how many rooms it has, but it had an awful lot of rooms. And it got passed down from generation to generation. You don't do that anymore now because the tax man usually takes all the money away from you. But in those days, you could pass the home on to the next one. So when her grandfather died in 1929, her father sort of inherited the family building, and in they all moved. I think it was a very cold building, and I'm not quite sure where Mariah's bedroom was. I think it was probably up there somewhere. And they were freezing cold, but they were big houses. So they lived there, and it was quite a spacious place. And because her parents were very keen on horses, the usual hunt would meet there occasionally, and you can see them galloping through the fields at one of the hunts there. And Mariah, one of the things that happened to her very early on in her days was that as soon as she was 2 years old, whether she liked it or not, she got plonked on a horse and told, you're going to have to ride. So whether you liked it or not, she was taught to ride. The other thing that she was taught to do quite early on was to dance. So she became quite a good dancer as well, even though she was very shy. But that came in handy a bit later on as well. So if you had a house like that, you needed rather a lot of people to look after it. So at the 25th anniversary of her parents' wedding, Mariah is there. These are all the staff and their husbands or wives who worked on the estate. And so her father's there, her sister's there, her brother's there, and that's Mariah. So that was quite an occasion. Just before the outbreak of the Second World War, and it wasn't long after that that the estate was sold up and everybody went their different ways. Their father was very keen, as well as being a very upright member of the local society. He used to help out in the village, and he was chairman of the local cricket team and various other things. That was expected of you in those days. So there he is, cheering the local cricket team, which I think they used to play cricket pretty close to where my mother lived. They certainly had a little hockey pitch on their lawn as well, I think. So that was that really. Mariah went off to a school at St George's in Ascot, and then she went to university to read maths. It sounds terrifying to read maths as a subject. She didn't quite finish her degree in maths at university, but what she did, she was obviously pretty good at maths, but she finished after about a year. And her father decided that, well, she couldn't just hang around at home, so she'd better join the ATS, which was the sort of territorial service, because he was chairman of the local branch. So Mariah was told firmly that she was going to join the ATS, and so that's where she was when war broke out. And August 1939, she was down in Exeter, I think it was Exmoor, having a holiday with her parents when they announced that the war was about to start. So her father sent her home straight away. He said, go home and sit by the telephone. I don't know quite what she expected to happen, but there you are. She was waiting for the phone call. Finally, the phone calls started to come. The first phone call said, can you cook? And, well, of course, a lot of people would say, of course I can cook. But she said, no, I can't cook, because she was never allowed into the kitchen as a child. So she said, I can't cook. So the phone went dead, and next day they phoned again. And they said, can you type? And she said, no, well, I can type with 2 fingers. She said, no, that's no good. And so the phone went dead again. So next day the phone went again and said, have you got matric? Anybody know what matric is? It's a sort of A-level, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And she got matric because she was good at maths. So she said, yes, I've got that. So they called her up straight away to Reading, and then she was selected very quickly to go and train to work in a top secret place where they for radar, so a place called Leighton Buzzard. They were training for radar, and so she was. That's right. She found that there was a sergeant there who was in charge of her, because she was a corporal, and anyway. Quite quickly the sergeant failed the security test, so Mariah found herself in charge of these young recruits. And so she found herself in the radar station. What I'm going to show you in a minute, just now, is a bit of TV footage, because 70 years after the Battle of Britain, the BBC said, well, we're going to have a big celebration at Westminster Abbey, and we want to interview some people. And they interviewed a pilot, and they interviewed somebody else, and they said, we'd like to speak to somebody who worked on the radar installations and so on. And there aren't very many people around who've done that. So they got hold of Mariah, and they interviewed her. And when they ran the service at Westminster Abbey, Mariah was interviewed. The interview was shown, and I'm going to show it to you now, provided everything works. And so she was sent to a place called Bentley Priory, which is the headquarters of Fighter Command in Stanmore, North London. And so this is where her war began. And
now, if you ask the pilots themselves, they'll tell you it wasn't just the aircrew who won the battle in the skies. They relied on a huge number of specialists supporting them from the ground, including the Royal Observer Corps, which is represented here today. Their work, less glamorous, of course, I suppose, than the aircrew, but also dangerous, was absolutely vital in making sure the Hurricanes and the Spitfires found their targets. They were the eyes and ears of the RAF throughout the war, and without them, the battle could never have been won. Ground crew included highly skilled engineers maintaining and repairing battle damage in the most difficult of circumstances. They suffered terrible losses when the airfields were bombed by the Luftwaffe. Bomber Command played their part in the battle by pounding the German invasion fleet assembling in the Channel ports. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force also did important work throughout the war. Most famously, of course, they operated the operations rooms and the radar stations. They were involved in critical intelligence work. They even packed parachutes for aircrew, and many a fighter pilot survived because the women made sure the chutes opened properly. Well, having joined the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, Mariah Hart went on to work at Bentley Priory, where she was one of the first WAFs to take over from men in the operations room. Later, she worked on the new secret weapon, radar. It was so secret then, she didn't even tell her parents what she was up to. When she was transferred into the newly formed WAF in 1939, she was surprised to find out she'd been promoted overnight.
So my uniform turned up and it had corporate stripes on. I don't know why. Perhaps because I'd been one of the original ATS people in 9 months before. When we were trained, we came back here to be the first WAF on the filter room. I'd got 2 stripes, so I was in charge of any watch that I was on. They weren't frankly pleased about having been ordered about by women, especially young ones like me. We were doing our job down below on the table, connected with one of the radar stations. So all we did was sort of look up and see who's up. Oh, that's Churchill. You know, literally, I mean, you didn't have a chance to talk to any of those people. You were doing a job and he just came to have a look at it. I was pushed onto the secret radar. We always knew it as RDF, range direction finding. And we knew it was very important, and the Germans didn't know enough about it yet. And so we were doing a good job of work. As we were so secret, as it were, that we enjoyed the fact that we were doing something that nobody else knew anything about. I can remember saying 50 plus and 100 plus. Because we could get advance warning, it made a big difference. So they could have time to get up high enough to be above the incoming. It was just touch and go whether they managed to get through or not. We just hoped they would. If we hadn't had direction finding, we wouldn't have got through. We regarded ourselves as the main reason why we stopped Hitler landing in England. So that was the end of the Battle of Britain, really.
Mariah Hart, and the pilots I've spoken to this week strongly agree that women like Mariah, the communications specialists and the others, were the key to victory. It was not just the pilots themselves. So Mariah is 94 next month. She's here today with her son and her grandson, whom you can see to the right of the picture there. He's a major in the army.
That was good, isn't it? There's no applause for that. She's pretty fearless, Mariah. She doesn't know what the meaning of fear is, and it's quite interesting. The BBC reporter was trying to make her say how frightened she was. So they kept saying to her, you know, how frightened were you when you saw hundreds of bombers coming in to bomb you? So when he'd asked the question about 3 times, she refused to answer it. She said, oh, no, she said, we just wanted our boys to go up there and shoot the German planes down. So she wasn't bothered about that. In fact, during the Battle of Britain, she was based on the East Coast, so a lot of it, as they bombed London, they were all coming straight over the heads and so on. But occasionally, when the masts, those big radar masts, would go wrong, somebody had to go up and sort of adjust where they were pointing. And of course, a lot of people were terrified because it's 300 feet up. But Mariah never worried about having to climb up and do things like that. So she put the men to shame occasionally, I think, with that. She was later posted up to the Scottish Islands, and she worked as a radar up there and had lots of interesting experiences. But there was one amusing one, I think, where they found it rather strange having a woman up there working with certainly a woman officer. And so being a woman in uniform, she was a complete novelty, and in some places was regarded with suspicion. In fact, on one island she was told, they don't like women in uniform round here, and you're carrying a handbag over your shoulder, which is not allowed on a Sunday. So she was learning that life up in the islands is not quite like it was in the south of England. So, in the beginning of 1945, as the war was towards the end of the war, she moved to the biggest palace in Italy, one of the biggest palaces in the world, actually, and Caserta, near Naples. And so this was, I forget which floor she worked on, but it was huge. This was the Allied headquarters, so she was working there. And because things were winding down, her boss, who's a group captain in the Air Force, said, could you go and find us some horses to ride? We're a bit bored. We want to go and ride some horses. You know a bit about horses. Go and see if you can find one. So she tried to get hold of the army. And a chap in the building there said, yes, he'd got some horses. And his name was a chap called John Hart. And she started to talk. And he said, where are you from? She said, I'm from Berkshire. She said, where in Berkshire? Arborfield. And then he said, where are you from? And then, of course, he said, well, we know each other. We used to play tennis as kids, way back then. So he supplied her with some horses to ride, and so they got to know each other quite well out in Italy. And so that was very good. In fact, because she was quite good at riding horses, when the troops needed entertaining, they had the old horse race. And on one occasion, unbeknown to her, she was put into this race, and they got her to ride, but they swapped the horses. They didn't. Only certain people knew they'd swapped the horses. And she was given a very good run horse, which won rather easily, and a few people made a lot of money on her. She didn't actually know. But the person whose horse was borrowed for the afternoon was very cross. But some people made a lot of money gambling on Mariah, so she was very popular. So she and John Hart got to know each other quite well, and the war finished. And so I suppose romance was in the air a bit. I don't think it was on her mind much, but he obviously was interested in popular questions, so he did. And she said yes, and they had a choice of where they were going to live. On one hand, he could have gone back to his veterinary practice in Leighton Buzzard, or you had other options at the end of the war. And, oops, hang on, gone too quick. Now this is one of these wonderful old maps, which says the British Empire of the British people. And you can see there used to be a lot of the map that was pink, because that's the bit that belonged to Britain. I think there's only a bit of Britain, the Isle of Wight and Gibraltar these days, but anyway, there used to be quite a lot that belonged to Britain. And you could go almost anywhere after the war. And they decided to go there, to a place called, to go to Kenya, because there was, or Kenya as they called it then, but they call it Kenya now. And so that's where they decided to go. And Mariah was only too pleased to leave the sort of rather claustrophobic lifestyle of rural Berkshire and to have a little bit of adventure. So they decided to go out there, fairly short notice. And so her mother said, well, if you're going to go out to Africa, you know, your father's not very well, he's had several strokes, so you better get married straight away. So she got married at a week's notice. They literally put something in the paper, and quite a few people turned up, but that was a week's notice. And so her parents are that side, and her husband's parents here, and the best man. And that was in Arborfield. And so they had a honeymoon lasting one day, and my father then got on a ship and went to Africa. And Mariah's job was then to try and follow him to Africa. And 6 months later, she still hadn't got there, because it was so difficult to find any boat to take you there. And so, but finally, she did manage to get onto a boat. So there's the wedding photos. And she did actually finally get out to Kenya. Now this is a map of Kenya. Any of you know it? You land at the port of Mombasa, and the old railway line goes all the way up through Nairobi, which is the capital, and Nakuru, and then Kisumu up on Lake Victoria. This is the biggest lake in the world, Lake Victoria. And they decided to live around here, right out in the wilds, a place called Sotique, which you will not have heard of rather. And they inherited a rather large house with a few African servants who were beautifully trained in sort of cordon bleu cookery, which was fantastic. So Mariah did what she does best. Wherever she goes in the world, she starts a pony club, because there were a lot of bored kids around there. So she started a pony club to get all these kids together. And this is a painting from the time. And you can see, very rural environment. She did that. Very grateful the kids were for all that she did for them there. Occasionally she got into a bit of trouble there, because I think being a rural country, rural place, I think one day somebody came along with a dog that was foaming at the mouth, and she said, oh, leave it there, my husband will see to it when he comes home. And my father came home, he said, get out of the way quickly, that dog's got rabies. So the dog was shut up in an outside bathroom and went completely mad and bit through the pipes and so on. So the following day my father sort of said, well, tell you what, I'll line myself up on a table with a gun, and if somebody would open the door and let the dog out, I'll shoot the dog. So of course nobody really wanted to open the door and let the dog out, but finally somebody did, and out came the dog and they managed to shoot it. So she had a bit of an exciting life there, really, living out in the wilds. One thing she did, they moved down to a place called Ngong, which is down near Nairobi. You can see this is typical African countryside. It's lovely, really. Very open brush, lots of cattle, local cattle. And they moved down to live in this house. It was a bit better at the time, because this picture was taken about 5 years ago. But anyway, my brother and I were born there, corrugated iron roof, and that was the home we lived in. By then, of course, we were young and beautiful. That's my brother and I. Whoops, hang on, whoops. Whoops. Sorry, sorry. There we go. Mariah was actually very fortunate because her husband and a friend of his decided they'd buy a horse to go racing with. And they bought this horse, and it turned out that it wasn't very good at racing. It was a bit too small. And a friend of theirs said, well, why don't you try and see if it'll jump? So they had a go and saw if this horse would jump, and it rather liked it. And one memorable day they put it in for a competition, and to cut a long story short, Mariah entered the competition as a novice and then started competing against some almost professionals, and she ended up winning the competition, which was a cause for huge celebrations. And so she was one of those very fortunate people who ended up owning a wonderful horse. And I've actually got a little bit of footage, and I don't know if you ever remember, some of you will remember anyway, when we started having cameras, we had a sort of brownie box, which was a little camera, and it didn't take very good photos. But a bit later on, some people actually had a movie camera. You know, it was very, very rare. You had a movie camera, and it was far too expensive for us, so we never had one. But a friend took one of these cameras and filmed Mariah jumping in the middle of one of these competitions and gave it to us. So you're going to see a little bit of footage from 1950 something, 56 I think, Mariah in a jumping competition. The quality's not very good, but then it's whatever it is, 50 or 60 years ago. Here we go. You're going to show her 2 rounds. This is the first round, which ended up in people getting the same score. So she had to do a second round where they put the fences up. So this is Mariah jumping now. Well, the horse jumping actually.
Well done.
Yeah. She's a clever girl, isn't she? There you go. That's it. Well, she won quite a few competitions. Here's another one where she did a team competition. The chap on the right's an interesting character. His name is Digby Tatum Water, which doesn't mean very much to you. But actually in the middle of the Battle of Arnhem, which was where the parachutists went in, it was a terrible event. He tried to rally the troops by walking up and down with an umbrella in his hand and a bowler hat on, rallying the troops. So he's quite well written up, quite a famous chap for reckless bravery in the middle of so he was quite a character. And then here's a picture of, she won another competition when Princess Margaret was visiting, so there's her with Princess Margaret giving her a prize. The horse one day gave her more than she bargained for. He was out and he put his foot down the hole, and she fell on her head and was concussed for 2 weeks. So for a while she lost her memory completely for quite a long time. It took a long time to come back. Some of us complain about losing our memories. She actually lost hers permanently for quite a long time, but fortunately it all came back. She could so easily have been a paraplegic, but actually she came through that. So that was rather important for us. Years later, she went back. This famous horse of hers sort of caused a competition to be set up, had in its own name. And so about 4 years ago, Mariah went out to Kenya and she was able to present a prize to the winner of the competition. So that was rather nice. And there she's sitting in the crowd with all these people at the same place. And up there, of course, is Mariah visiting a place where there are giraffes. So she's introducing herself to a giraffe with Robert. For a short while, towards the end, they started, because they had a few horses, they said, well, Mariah was game to do anything. She decided she'd train a few horses. So she trained a few race horses. She was very lucky for Robert and I and my brother, because we were allowed to ride these horses at high speed. So Mariah did that for a little bit. And then the Kenya finished completely. When independence came, they had to leave the country, so that was the end of 20 years, fantastic years in Kenya, as they now call it. So they spent a few years in England, went out to a place called Botswana, which is right down in South Africa, and which was a very hot country, because most of it is the Kalahari Desert. And you know, they had a pretty good time, but I think it wasn't that memorable, but there was one occasion when somebody said, well, they went out into the sort of one of the areas where there are wild game and so on, and they put their tents out for the night, slept in their tents with some of the local workers with them. When they woke up in the morning, all the local workers were up a tree. They'd had a herd of elephants come through, and only Mariah, her husband, and one other chap had just stayed fast asleep as these elephants walked through the camp. So you know, she could have been rather squashed, I think, but she managed to escape that. So they moved on to Ethiopia in 1972, which was a much nicer place to be. Haile Selassie was in charge of the country. We visited them. This actually is Andrew. Andrew there, who's in there. This is actually Andrew. It's the first time we took him away. He went and visited Ethiopia. This is Mariah coming back from the shops in Addis Ababa. She had a bit of a reputation as a bit of a reckless driver, I'm told. Lots of people had to dive out of the way as she roared down the street, but that's only what somebody told me. I'm sure it's not true. Our father, he had to go out into the countryside a lot to work with the animals and work with the local chiefs, and drink a lot of raw whiskey and eat raw meat with them. So that's rather one of the perks of being a vet in that sort of part of the world. So that was not a bad country to be in. In fact, it was almost like Bible times, because if you see this is the countryside. Here they're winnowing straw. So you chuck the straw up the air and the grain falls to the ground and the chaff goes to the side. And here they're sort of grinding the grain out by sort of walking the cattle all over it. This is, it's almost biblical really. That's not biblical. They didn't look after their horses very well. But you saw a lot of these sites in Ethiopia when they lived there. So unfortunately, while they were there, there was a military coup. In fact, wherever they went, there seemed to be some military activity, because they were in the middle of the Mau Mau in Kenya, which was a rather tricky time for them. But as usual, Mariah and her husband were pretty fearless, and there was one day when the two girls who worked for them in the house rushed into the room saying, you know, there's bullets hitting the wall, there's guns everywhere. And her response and her husband's, no, don't worry about that, just get down, it's only a little bit of shooting. So they were very unworried by things like that. I think calm under fire is very much what Mariah's like. They finally left Ethiopia after about 5 years, and that was probably the end of my father's working career. Oh, just another picture there. This is Ethiopia. This is the Nile Valley, so you can actually, it's a bit faint, the picture, because the Nile gouges out huge ravines in the middle of the countryside around there. And as it starts on its way all the way down the Nile, down to the sea, it rains non-stop for about 3 months in Ethiopia, and it takes an awful lot of silt down to Egypt. So that was Ethiopia, and so they finally got back to England in about 1977, and that's our family shop then. So Mariah finally gave up riding horses, age 70, when she'd been bucked off one too many times, but she carried on helping out with riding for the disabled and so on. So that was good. And unfortunately, my father died 25 years ago, and so Mariah's been her own since then. But there you have the original picture of her. 60 years makes a difference, but she still looks pretty good on it, doesn't she? And only last week we had a family photo, and so she got all her sons, her 2 sons, and lots of grandsons and great-grandchildren. So she's had a pretty eventful life, and ending up here, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful place to be. And certainly she's enjoying her time here. But there's the tribe after all that time. And I think you'll agree with me that she's had a pretty interesting life, and one that sort of certainly gets us thinking about her own. All right. Thank you so much.